Hi Yuval, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you.
I'm just talking that you're from very many places,
Yeah.
because you're urban planner working in Brazil, and now you started your career
Yeah.
as a lecturer in.
Not exactly. So, well, I'm originally from Israel, and I've been living all over the world in Netherlands and Australia and South Korea, and then in Brazil I spent a lot of years, working as an urban designer, and there I set up Urb-i with my colleagues. So, which is the reason why I was invited here to give a talk. And now recently I just moved to Canada to do some research work at university. So continuing this in the same topic, but now I'm more focused on research.
Okay, I would like to start the conversation about the thing that you're most famous, because you're responsible for the, I don't know, let's call like the action for before after photos that show how places has changed after before with cars, and then after like a renovation with the removal of the cars.
Yes, that's true. So we have the what we call the before after project, which I started as a hobby actually because I love to research cities and I love maps, which I've always loved in the past. So when there was a Google Street View, there was an opportunity to see closely the public space of everywhere around the world. And around 2015, there were already enough photos because Google takes photos in many years. So there was an option in Google Maps that you can see past years. So I used that to compare different locations and see the changes that happened. And then I decided to document different streets which had a positive transformation. And we started sharing this first on social media back in, I think, in the middle of 2015, and then created a website. And this got a lot of attention and a lot of positive responses. So it kind of grew. And from there, I started to look in many countries, and volunteers started to help. And people would send emails from all around the world sending their locations. So it started to grow and started to be a really mapping project of locations, but it was always based on what's available on Google Street View mostly.
Yeah. So how many places you have found till yet?
Well, we have on the website 3,300 images.
Oh yeah, it's a lot.
So in the beginning, we just had around 300 images and it was already enough for, like, all the articles were written when there was hardly anything. Like, I mean, in terms of numbers, was much less. And then it grew and grew, and but since last year I stopped updating it, so it's now stable on 3,300. I have a list. I have my own to-do list of new places, but I unfortunately have discontinued updating it. So I have like 1,000 more places, but I have no more means to continue the project. But there's always more and more and more places. And also, as Google takes images again in different countries, it always becomes more available. Because the problem is also finding a transformation. You need 2 images and you need enough years between. Yeah. So the more the Google Street View passes in different countries and cities, the more possibility there is to find transformations. Like some countries, Google passed once in 2008 or something, and then they didn't do it again, so it's almost impossible to find, except if someone sent a photo and you can compare. But for example, Germany, they had the privacy issue, so Google took in 2008 different cities, but then it didn't renew it. So although I know there's many transformations in Germany, it was really hard to find the after photo. So what you see on the website also depends on the actual database, what can be found. So, and at the time, Poland, I think, had images from 2009 and 2014 maybe when I did it. So it's not that many years, but we found a few. If you look now recently, I think there's images from 2017 and maybe 2018, so it's possible to find many more transformations which are not included on the website, but they could be added in the future.
Yeah. I've noticed that most of the places of course, there's a very this selection is very specific because they all include or exclude cars. Yeah.
Yes.
And this is like a, I would say, like a fashion around the world, that they are so many places are changing from the like very open for cars to the like I don't know who, the government, the designers try to like diminish the role of the car transportation in the places. It's like
so it is like a trend that it's happening, often led by local government, so which really have the power to do these transformations, but not always. I mean, this is happening everywhere around the world.
Yeah, but why? Do you have any clues?
Yeah. Well, I think in recent years, like the idea of having more livable cities has become a really important issue, and like people see the negative effects that the car took on the public space. So the car, it's not only parking, but it's sometimes, and a lot of these transformations are pretty small. They're like junctions which had really large curves for the cars and therefore were unsafe. So maybe the junction was made a bit with less space for the cars and safer places for the pedestrians to cross. So some transformations are small. Others in more dense areas where there's a lot of flow of pedestrians are transformations to pedestrian streets or more pedestrian streets, or what is called shared streets. So a shared street are also for cars, but cars are guests in an area. So it's a bit newer, so there's less examples, but this is also becoming a trend. And in today's world, I think regionalism is not so much important anymore, because people use a similar solutions, similar examples from all over the world. So like we see these references everywhere. So I don't think that you can say that one country does a specific type and another, but I think that these concepts are flowing all over the world.
Yeah, but one of these most famous changes was the redesigning of Times Square in New York. You know, which was like super iconic for like car traffic, with advertising on the street, and so now this is very like a pedestrian friendly space.
So this example specifically is it's more interesting because it didn't happen just from the top down. They decided let's change it, and they changed it. It was a whole process. So at Urb-i we try and focus on these temporary and transformations that happen in phases. So in Times Square, that's what happened, because in the beginning, if they would tell to the public we're going to close Times Square and it's going to be pedestrian, they wouldn't be able to approve it, because people would be like, no way, we're going to close Broadway. So what happened is they just did tests. So first of all, they did what we call an ephemeral test, which is something which you can remove in the same day even. So if you just put cones and some chairs and maybe some tables and some activities, this is all removable. So you can already test and see how the space works. And it's not a problem, because at the end of the day, you can put it all away. So people can't really be against it if you say it's an event, right? And then people like this, and they saw that people accepted this idea. So they went on to do what we call temporary phase. And the temporary means that you do actions which are more permanent in a way. So you paint, and you can even put some benches, screw them to the ground, and put like big pots with plants. You paint the actual street, but you don't do anything infrastructural. So, and it's a testing period. So in this period, the people can use it, and we can test and see how they use it. So we can ask them on the spot, like, how do you feel in this space right now? Rather than if you'd show them a render of some future design and go, do you approve of this new project, right? Because people can only it's just an image. They don't have the capacity to imagine so much them inside the image.
The image is usually nicer than reality.
It's not about so much. Yeah, also it's nice, but it's more the experience, the spatial experience that you have when you're in the place and you're using it. So you're walking through it, or you're sitting and resting, or you're enjoying the space. You have a really different experience, and you can say how you feel at that moment, at that space. It's not speculating on some image. So in the temporary phase, they did a lot of measuring and counting and seeing how people use the space, and people approved it. And another thing about the temporary, about approving it, is that when you say, look, if it's not going to work, we'll just take away the benches and the pots, and we'll paint it. We'll take the paint off or paint it black, and then the cars can go back again. So like the people that are against it, it's like, okay, it's a test, and if it really doesn't work, then we can always go back. But usually this doesn't happen. So the testing phase was successful, and people adopted it. They really liked it. So then they decided to move to the permanent phase, which is just taking all the infrastructure away, putting new pavement, and just doing what we call a permanent project.
Yeah. How much time did it take them?
I'm not sure exactly, but our images show from 2009, I think, was about the ephemeral one where they just tested, and 2011 they did the temporary. I mean, the image was captured. In 2014 it was already permanent. Some part of
the
some
first
part
experiments
of the space,
were like
so
15 years ago, and then within 5 years they moved to the permanent.
10 years ago, like 2009 was when they started. So
Okay.
I think in like 5 years they managed to do it pretty quickly. But other projects, even in New York, it took more time. The idea in New York was that they implement this as an actual strategy to change places. But I think other projects, the temporary stayed longer because they needed more time for approval of the permanent or finance it. So,
Yeah.
but I'm
Especially
not
that
sure.
Times Square is super iconic. So
Yeah.
it's difficult space to change. I would like to ask you about your own projects,
Mhm.
because in Urb-i you do the similar projects in Brazil.
Yeah. So at Urb-i we did one project which was actually gone through the ephemeral and the temporary phase, and now we're looking into doing the permanent. The city is looking into doing permanent, and this was a project which actually was what we formed the whole group around. So back in 2014 we participated in this competition of there was a few train stations and the area around it. We had to think about the accessibility to the train area. So we thought about the whole district of the train and know about permanent solutions and future ideas. But we also took one little street which is right next to the station, where it's a small street which almost no cars pass, but the sidewalks are really narrow, and every time a train comes, lots of people just roll out of the station in the morning rush hour and in the evening rush hour, and people just walk in the middle of the street, so because there's no space. So we took that little street in our competition as an example, a pilot, and we showed how it would look in a temporary situation with paint and widening the sidewalk and some plants, and then in a permanent situation. And a few years later, we didn't really but someone that was organizing a car-free day, he was inspired by our project, so he chose this street, and they did an event, so what we call the ephemeral, which was one day, and they closed the street and had like food trucks and grass, synthetic grass, and we showed our project there, so we did some consultation, and people could show their opinion about how they use the space and what they would like, so we could talk to the people. And then a year later, when the city managed to approve, together with the NGO that we were working with, that was one of the organizers of this competition, so we managed to approve the project for the temporary. So then it was painted and with bollards, and we initially planned like benches and planters, but that didn't eventually happen. But at least the sidewalks were widened, there were more pedestrian crossings added, so that improved dramatically the situation there. So that was one of our main projects. Other than that, we did a lot of more ephemeral experiments, so some of them formal, some of them informal, but we did a lot of experimentation in different locations in the city. However, none of them continued to a temporary phase, so it was only a short time where we could test it. But still, we did have quite a lot of impact.
Yeah, but the couple of years ago, I was on the meeting between like old school urban planners and architects and like new school, and actually there was a big division between them, because the younger ones thought that actually it is, you need to show to the citizen what's happening in the city, all the databases, the maps, and so on and so on. Try to consult as much as possible, even most of the private investments in the city. And the older ones thought like, no, actually, like the architect and urban planner is like a demigod, that actually he should know better, because the citizens don't know what they need, and this architect should know better. But actually it turned out that this old school was no good. Actually they were wrong, because mostly they tried like the point of view depends on like all the how to say it, usually typical expectations, like so much this number of car park spaces and so on,
or engineering solutions. Well, I think that the participatory way of designing is now pretty much adopted by most cities. So I guess this old school way of not consulting and not showing to the public is not common anymore. However, even this participatory way of doing projects is also, you also have to think about how to participate. So like a lot of places, they do a project and then they do the participatory thing, like this is our project, and then people like, oh, I'm against it, and it's not exactly participatory from the beginning. It's after they already have the solution, then they share it with the public, and then maybe they make a few little changes, but basically they're just showing to the public because they're obliged to. So that's also kind of what some cities understand as participatory. But I think doing the project from the beginning with the target group or with the users is a much more participatory way, and I think there is still more work to be done and to go towards working in this direction. So that's why I think that these tactical urbanism solutions, which are doing things in phases, work, because they're not only about consulting, they're about real testing in real life and with the real users. So you don't have to call a meeting and only people that have time that arrive in the city hall, whatever, to show their opinion. You're actually testing it with the actual people on the street, and it's not about hearing their opinion, it's about even just looking and observing and seeing how they use the space while you're testing a new configuration. So I think if part of the budget that's destined for this consultation is used for these temporary transformations. So usually a temporary transformation is 10% of the cost of the permanent, because the permanent requires heavy infrastructure, and even the ephemeral one is even 10% of the temporary, because it's just one day, it's very light things. So if you could include these ways of designing already as part of the solution, I think that would be a very healthy way of going about. And then you would only do the permanent stage after you would have done this, because usually what happens is they spend all this money on doing the permanent solution and planning it, and then to change it, they're like, oh, but we already designed it, so if we just change something little, but not the essence of it. So I think after you do all this testing, then you can go and do the permanent solution and not start with a permanent. But at the same time, it's important that when you are testing a configuration, that you think of a permanent. So when you're testing a new configuration of the street, you have to think about the permanent, but think of different options. So you can test. So for example, you there's a street and you decided that you'll widen on this side the sidewalk to test it, on the other side you put a bike lane, and then you test it and you see that there's something that's not functioning well, and so you switch it or change the size. You can do this with tactical urbanism, and you can't do this with a permanent situation. So in Sao Paulo there's an example. They had a lot of bike lanes, which most of the bike lanes were done in this way. Some of them were done permanently, some of them more iconic on the main avenues, but some were painted and were tested to see how people use them. And there was this one stretch of a bicycle lane which was done in front of a few restaurants in the square, and these restaurants we used to have a valet parking kind of solution for their customers. So they were complaining and they were starting to park on top of the cycle lane. So what they did is, because it's just paint, they repainted around the square, the cycleway, and then they added these parking spaces that were lost. So this is only possible if you're using this kind of temporary solution. So I think it's not about planners knowing it all from before. It's about testing it in real life, and then So, I think that this is the important aspect of it.
Does it work for like brand new projects? You just see, you have to build completely new street, like 2 kilometers long, and this is super difficult to like test.
You mean like in a greenfield side of a new neighborhood?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that's a different kind of approach altogether, because you're starting with nothing, so you're starting without the people, and usually you build and then the people come later, right? So it's difficult to do this whole testing, but you can definitely leave room for this in your project, because you actually have more flexibility to plan all the phases from the beginning. So if there's the one crucial area in the project which you want to be the liveliest, then you can leave that for a testing, right? And I think it definitely can be incorporated, because when you do phases, you get the liveliness doesn't always come first, right? So especially if you have maybe shopping centers or these type of kind of buildings in your new project, you can try and see how the area which temporarily can be used as parking space, but in the future there will be buildings there. So you can do a lot of testing and use this. It's not only for public spaces, you can use it for private spaces and public spaces.
Okay. Where we can find your projects? What's your website?
So you can find the Urb-i's website is www and Urb-i, so URB and line I.com. And you can go there to the before after project and see the whole before after database, the gallery, and you can see other projects that we did. Most of them are in Portuguese. Some projects we have bilingual, but the before after you can find everything in English as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have talk tomorrow.
And also
in
we have the Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. So
okay, you have talk tomorrow in the museum. It's from Miasto Myśli cycle. About what will you talk?
Mm-hmm. So in my talk tomorrow, I wanted to kind of. So I was talking to Pavel Jablowski, that's organizing. He was inviting me. And he has done similar projects here using tactical urbanism. So
in Krakow, in Szczecin, and Dąbrowa nearby.
Okay. And so we talked about the struggle, and some things were similar, some of the struggles were similar, and some were different. And so I thought to centralize to focus the talk around the issue, which I think is the main concerning factor, which is the automobile status quo. So it's I think this is the main issue, and I think that the tactical urbanism is just one way of challenging it, but it's only a small piece in the puzzle. So that's my main theme, and within it I want to talk a bit about how do we visualize and how do we perceive the status quo, how it works. Then I want to show these examples that we talked about, like the before-after project and tactical urbanism, or all these projects that we did, interventions, formal and informal. Something about challenging it through education. And to finalize, which is something very important, is to see how we can challenge it in the future. So currently I am more focused on researching how new mobility and new new technological solutions will affect the public space, and this is the area I'm focused on now. So I want to kind of finish the talk with this vision towards the towards this new mobility and how that's going to impact, because I think that's going to be a major disruption which may happen. And there's with the technological advances of, for example, mobility as a service, I think this has a real it's a real possibility that it can challenge the car ownership model.
Okay, so thank you for the talk.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me.
Wszystkich zapraszamy jutro na wykład Yuvala i w ogóle na cały cykl Miasto Myśli, który odbywa się w Muzeum Śląskim co czwartek. Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękuję.